it limits sort of like the assets you're able to get in return, and who knows exactly what they're asking for. But I do think that in this case, this is just when you hear things like, we want to keep winning now, we don't want to trade him to a Western Conference team because that means it'll be harder for us to make the playoffs right now. Well, like if the roster is what it is, that's still a young enough roster to kind of undergo a little bit of a retooling. Like they don't need to be the 8th seed. Now, one of the things is, and I've talked to some evaluators that aren't crazy about this upcoming draft, that don't feel it's as deep as the drafts have been the last 2 years, so that, you know, the incentive to tank right now or to keep the 13th pick versus making the playoffs and maybe even getting that playoff revenue, like there's not as much incentive maybe to bottom out right now. But when I look at Minnesota, again, that's a team that I don't see a super clear pathway for them to get to that upper echelon in the Western Conference as is. A trade certainly would be one way they could gather a couple new assets. Maybe they get a couple contracts off of their books that they want to shed, and they can become players. I don't think they'll ever be a top tier free agency destination. It's it's too cold.
Yeah, I mean, look, getting Towns' name on the 5-year, $190 million contract at least gives you, two cornerstone players. Towns, I think, no argument, legitimate franchise player. Wiggins, separate conversation. He really didn't. Yeah,
that doesn't really feel like a cornerstone. I mean, to me, that he feels like kind of the free agent they might be able to sign and overpay at some point, right? Yeah. It's like when those kind of guys hit the market. I think the other thing, too, that's really interesting about Jimmy Butler, and I wrote about this last week, is sort of this tier of superstar, right? Like I think I used the term like sort of stars. Like he's a superstar for sure, but no, like this class of guys that are going to get max contracts. That's what Jimmy Butler wants, is like the 5-year, $190 million max, right? And I don't know that you can win a title paying him that kind of money. Especially a guy that's going to be into his mid-30s with the Tibbs minutes on him, who's at best an average 3-point shooter, a terrific defender, no question, but a guy who it's hard to project him being better than he is right now. I think the mileage on him, those feel like hard minutes that he's played. We know what Tibbs does at practice too, and how he wears those guys down. I think for a team like the Clippers, for instance, right, a team that does have 2 max slots, like they have to be asking themselves real questions about, and I know teams are doing this, can he be our number 2? And I think for other teams that are like the Miami Heat, for instance, where he'd be down there as their number 1, now they're in a unique situation because of their cap. They're so handcuffed. This is the only way they can really get anybody, is that they can go trade for somebody. But I don't know how you feel about him as a player. I mean, I think he's a borderline All NBA player. But a guy, though, again at 29, I compared him a little bit to Blake Griffin, and sort of like when I looked at their numbers, their All NBA appearances, their All Star appearances, they're all kind of right in line with each other. Blake has had the more catastrophic injuries, but both guys are pretty sure about to miss at least 15 games every year.
Yeah, with anybody, when you get to guys at this stage, you're at some point during their big contract,
you're going to be overpaying them.
You're going to be paying for past performance. Yes, you're going to be giving them money that they don't deserve at that point. The key is getting enough years out of that before you get to that point. Like I thought Boston has gotten a lot out of Al Horford. I mean, they're going to be paying Al Horford at the end of this deal a lot of money, but Al Horford had arguably his most complete year last year. It was huge for them in the playoffs. Jimmy Butler, do you get through 2 years of a new max deal before you're like, oh man, this guy is really an albatross around our neck? Now, I think he's a terrific player, but he's been injury prone. He's been battling injuries 3 of the last 4 years, I believe. And last year,
the question is too, is like, I mean, how well do perimeter defenders age, right? I mean that's
not well.
That's certainly a position that you need a base level of athleticism in the current NBA. I wish he shot it like 38% from 3 instead of 34%. Like, I mean, these are little things, but like when we're nitpicking, but when I think you're talking about a guy being, the second piece to a title or something like that, because I think, teams like, especially a team like the Clippers that just blew it up because they didn't have a title contender, right? Like their pathway to a title did not exist. This is a team that very much still wants to win an NBA championship, right? So where does Jimmy Butler fit into that? Does a team built around Kawhi Leonard and Jimmy Butler get you there? Can that team compete with the Warriors? I'd say probably on paper, no. I don't think so. I think that you need that second guy has got to be just a tick higher, just a level up. Doesn't have to necessarily be that Kevin Durant, LeBron James, Steph Curry level of superstar, but that second tier of guys, I think that's where you need to live. You need to find two of those guys if that's the path you're taking. And if you talk yourself into Butler, to me, part of that is because you just don't have other options.
One thing I wonder, and look, we'll learn a lot as when Butler finally comes, either gets traded or comes back to the team. But, why wasn't this handled 3 or 4 months ago? 3 or 4 months ago, the Wolves could have spent the offseason like the Pacers did with Paul George, like the Spurs did with Kawhi Leonard, and dealt with it. We're now into training camp, and this just surfaced as a trade demand a couple of days ago. Did they not know about it back in? You knew there was some issues.
I read something where he had been voicing unhappiness for a few months.
I've read a lot of that too. I've heard a lot of that.
And maybe again, when your coach is your decision maker, that's something like, oh, we'll figure it out. That's my Tibbs impression.
But if they're at the point where they have a sense of urgency to deal him in the coming days, and that's what it seems like, they want to move off this. Looks ownership.
It feels like it could happen before we're done taping this. Right?
It absolutely could. They're not going to get the best possible offer. And think about it. Look at what Paul George fetched a year ago. We didn't know what Victor Oladipo was at that point. Victor Oladipo was a serviceable third or fourth option. We didn't know he was going to turn to the most improved player in the NBA or one of at that point. So and no draft pick was involved in that deal. Kawhi Leonard was traded for DeMar DeRozan, a guy I think Toronto might have been trying to move off of anyway, just to move off of that contract and go into a full rebuild, which is still something on the minds of the Raptors. Now, what are you going to get for Butler? You can certainly argue that Kawhi, more valuable than Butler. Paul George, more valuable than Butler. Is the offer really going to be any better? I mean, Miami can't offer you draft picks. The Clippers and Nets and Knicks aren't going to get into a bidding war over this guy, not when they have the cap space to sign him outright this summer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, it's a situation as maybe you can get an asset out of this if you're Minnesota, but you might be taking on a contract that you don't love in the short term either. It's not a clean break here doesn't seem like this doesn't feel like a trade where everybody's going to come out of this happy, right? Isn't
that a reason? Isn't that reason to tell them to show up and to play? I mean, unless you get an offer that blows you away, a young piece that you can add to this group, show up, play. Maybe you figure it out. You're right. If Butler goes, the Timberwolves could be one of those teams that slips out of the playoff mix. If Butler stays, they're a conference finalist candidate. I think. I believe it. Look, before Butler got hurt, where were they? They were right there in that 4-5 type of mix. You give the young players another year to develop, maybe they get a little bit better. Houston took a step back. Utah, I think, will take a step forward, but the Blazers, they're a candidate to be right there in the conference finals.
I think I tend to look at sort of some of their dysfunction as a reason why I don't think they'd be making that step forward. I know some of that is with the beauty of kind of knowing stuff now that happened last year, and you read Jamal Crawford said some stuff. Obviously Jimmy Butler's unhappy. We've seen I've never seen a contract subtweet quite the way the Karl Towns contract subtweets. You know what I mean? And some of his statements, it's not a good situation over there. At least that's how it reads from afar. When you see the way this conference is kind of shaken out, and when you kind of start listing teams in your mind, which is something I've had to do here recently for our preview section. One of the fun things you get to do when you walk into a job like mine right now is oh great, now go predict the order of finish for the entire league. And you start looking about who's going to fall out of the Western Conference picture. To me, Minnesota is more of a candidate to do that than they are to contend in the finals. I think that one of the things we know more is that Tibbs hasn't been at the helm of a contender in a while. I think that roster isn't as good as it needs to be. They haven't brought in any young talent. They traded Justin Patton's out again for another season. That pick is pretty much lost at this point. They haven't. Who have been their free agent acquisitions?
Nothing really.
Yeah, nothing significant. Nothing significant, right? So to me, they're a team that didn't get much better. They're counting on Karl Towns getting better, which he will, and they're counting on Andrew Wiggins getting better, which he might. And I think obviously when you add in the fact that Jimmy Butler is clearly unhappy and doesn't want to be there, and you're right, they could force him, I suppose, right? Or they could fine him every day, and you could kind of leverage him that way. But it's a lose-lose situation for them right now. There's no good way out of this. They're going to end up not getting as much for him as he's probably worth. But again, like I kind of hinted at before, his market is confusing to me to begin with. I think in some ways he's almost more attractive as a rental. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like for a team like if Houston can figure something out, you know what I mean? Or a team that just, Philadelphia. Like to me, those teams, he may even make more sense in sort of that, like, we're going to have you for a year, we're going to try to win a title, and then we're not going to give you that max than he does for a team that's looking at him as, we're going to want this guy to be a face of our franchise for the next 5 years.
Mm. All right, from one team that could slide out of the playoffs to maybe another, the Pelicans, they made some interesting moves this offseason. They let DeMarcus Cousins walk, which I understand. They had a lot of success last year with Nikola Mirotic as the 4-man alongside Anthony Davis at the 5. It seems like they developed chemistry. And Cousins, the Achilles injury comes down to money too. How much money do you want to spend on DeMarcus Cousins?
And you're betting on someone coming back from injuries that big men have traditionally struggled coming back.
Really struggle with. At the same time, they also let Rajon Rondo walk, effectively swapped out Rondo for Julius Randle with the Lakers. Now the news this week, Anthony Davis fires his agent. He goes over to Clutch Sports. Rich Paul is his agent. Rich Paul is also LeBron James' agent. LeBron James had a lot of guys that are represented by Clutch Sports play for him in the past. With the Lakers, you already have Kentavious Caldwell-Pope there. What did you make of Anthony Davis's, not his decision to switch agents, happens all the time, but to go to LeBron's agent?
I mean, I don't know if I was supposed to see this, but I happened to see the Lakers media day schedule for 2020, and it said future Rich Paul client at 1:30 p.m. right after LeBron. We don't know who that will be yet. It's a mystery. Maybe Tristan Thompson. But no, it obviously that's the first thing you think is like, Anthony Davis is going to be a Laker. Is like the first to me, and this was always sort of the pie in the sky, like my weird, crazy. I've already had bar arguments about this even before I was covering the NBA again. And this is just completely wild speculation. But like to me, that would be a guy like if you want to shove all your assets to the table and say like we want to get another star here, like that's the guy you do. That guy is Warriors. Like the Warriors have no answer for someone like that. I feel like pairing him with a player like LeBron James would be. Has anybody used the term lob city before? I feel like there would be a lot of lobs. There would be elements of that. And this just kind of gives that total weird like fantasy thing just a little bit of life, right? And it's another thing that it's hard to imagine a player of his ilk re-signing in New Orleans when you see kind of what the crowds are like at their games, during the regular season. I don't know how it is for you, but like when I've gone through there, in the past, I don't know if it changed last year, but 2 years ago, going through there on the Clippers, you'd go in there and it would be 60% full and stuff. And it's a great city. There's a lot to do there, which is probably why it's not as crowded. and it's hard to imagine that he would spend his prime in a situation where he's, clawing to be the 7th seed every year. Which
I found, look, that's why I found the decision to let Rondo walk so perplexing. Now, I understand it for some degree. Rondo, for all his magic in the playoffs, the regular season, he's a grab bag, really. Like, some days he plays great, but you get to a mid-December game against Orlando and you might lose
again with Rondo.
Orlando. The Magic aren't going to be good, so we won't be talking about that
good.
All that much.
They're not a sponsor on the pod?
They are not. We are not sponsored by the Orlando Magic. However, I get that part of it, but this guy was magic last year in the playoffs.
Orlando
Magic. He was spectacular in the playoffs last year. He dominated, 2 high-level point guards in Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum in the first round. They didn't get out of the second round, but they were trending in a positive way with that group. That's why it surprised me that they let a player of that caliber walk to replace him with an Elfrid Payton, really. And I guess you move Holiday back to the 1, but you had some good things there, and they let it go.
Well, and that's their path. That's like their one pathway, right? To keep Anthony Davis is you have to get to championship level. Like that's really, you have to be in that mix to convince him to stay. Otherwise, it's in the modern NBA, it's hard. When rookies go to these markets that aren't, and people say that market size doesn't matter, and look, like a guy like Russell Westbrook has proven that you can keep a guy in a smaller market for X amount of years, but that feels more of an exception than a rule to me.
It's not just the exception. It's that Westbrook also, if Westbrook didn't have that infrastructure there of Sam Presti and now Billy Donovan, but mostly Presti, like if he didn't know that he had some of the smartest people in the world backing him there, I think
too, he has like the right personality for it too. Like I think there's a lot of things that kind of go into having someone who has literally can take a map of the United States and say like, I want to work and live anywhere I want the money's going to be the same anywhere, pretty much.